Why did the Army pick icy Alaska when it wanted to train troops for fighting in tropical hotspots like the Middle East or Central America?
Well, I had to answer the same questions before Congress, and I couldn't give them any better answer than I'm giving you now. But as a, political appointee, I had to support the decisions once made.
The answer is that the Army established this base to curry favor with Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, then a powerful subcommittee chairman with a decisive voice on Pentagon spending.
3 rounds detonating near the lead aircraft resulted in loss of control of the drone, a scored kill.
Why does the Pentagon sometimes put out phony test results to make weapons look better than they are? A colonel who ran live fire tests blames the system.
And I think that's kind of a corrupt process where a guy goes from being an advocate of a system, the formal official advocate, whose job it is to sell it to everybody, and then he's put in charge of testing it to see if it's any good.
When American troops came under fire in Lebanon and Grenada, why couldn't the Army and Navy even talk to each other on their radios? The Senate's ranking Democratic expert on defense.
If we can't even have our Army and our Navy and our Air Force and Marines with compatible communication equipment, how in the world do we ever expect to defend Europe, for instance, with 14 allied nations all speaking different languages?
Why is it that despite the most expensive defense buildup in history, the former Army Chief of Staff says the Army still isn't battle ready?
We're getting better people, getting better equipment, we're improving the training, but the Army still couldn't go to war because the sinews of war, the ability to be able to get off to war and sustain you when you got there, weren't in place.
These are troubling comments, all the more alarming because they come not from doves and liberals, but from pro-defense senators and four-star generals. What's more, these problems of bum weapons, stacked tests, bad communications, and crippled combat capability are not the failure of one military service or one administration, nor are they chance events. They are predictable outcomes of the Pentagon power game, the ingrained politics of national defense. These problems reflect flaws built into the way our government operates in any administration. Hello, I'm Hedrick Smith. This is the second of 4 broadcasts about how Washington really works. It focuses on how our national defense can be undermined, even crippled, by the Pentagon power game. Back in 1961, President Eisenhower was the first to warn of the dangers of self-serving alliances.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
President Kennedy and his Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, were plagued by a different element of the Pentagon power game, inter-service rivalry. The huge military buildup under Reagan fueled the game. Tonight, we will look at some case studies from the Reagan period to show you the core of the problem and its consequences for the nation. First, a few key players. For the Pentagon, former Navy Secretary John Lehman, a slick power player who knows how to get what he wants. Also for the Pentagon, Caspar Weinberger, who got big money in his first years, but then ran into political trouble by alienating powerful members of Congress. And for the opposite power bloc, the dissidents, Vietnam War veteran and Republican conservative Congressman Denny Smith.
They're cheating. They're cheating on the tests, and that's the big factor here. And it's the only way we can really determine whether anything is any good. If they don't run honest tests, and they weren't running honest tests, you get a machine that won't do the job.
Also for the dissidents, Marine Colonel Tom Carter, who risked his career because he did not want to see GIs given bad weapons.
These are people, my fellow soldiers, if you will, who are going to have to use this, and their lives will depend on it. And if it doesn't work, then there are going to be more lives lost.
This is a high-stakes game. In peacetime, the big chips are pork and turf. Turf meaning a share of the action, and pork meaning big bucks and lots of jobs. This is a very high-stakes game for the nation, too. For as we take you inside the Pentagon power game, you will see that many important security decisions are not made for national security reasons. They are driven by the push for money and jobs and the parochial interest of congressmen and the military services. The main Pentagon power game is the clash of power triangles. Think of them as two teams battling for supremacy, one trying to keep the flow of money going for new weapons and military bases, and the other keeping watch on the flow to help make sure the public gets the best bang for its buck and that defense really works. But the two teams have unequal strength. The Iron Triangle combines the political muscle of the military services, defense contractors, and powerful committees in Congress. The underdog team, the Dissident Triangle, is an alliance of in-house Pentagon critics and whistleblowers in the so-called Pentagon Underground, and the press, to whom bad news is leaked, and Congress. Not Congress as a whole, but individual members with a reformist slant on the military. The dissidents include conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, but all have a streak of political independence, like Republican Denny Smith. Smith arrived in Congress from Oregon, a member of the Republican right, but he became an outspoken critic of the Pentagon's ingrained habits. His war experience as a combat pilot in Vietnam gave him special credentials.
Okay, this morning's mission, we're going to run a 4v4 sweep against the F-15s in the area 465. We have the entire area today, so we got a lot of room to operate.
It's 7:30 a.m. Congressman Smith is getting briefed at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida for mock combat on the F-16 fighter.
We can kill the opponents if at all possible, and that's definitely what we want to do. We try to take their numbers down. But the biggest thing is for us to live through the engagement. Maintain our mutual support, that's how we're going to survive. Get all ready to go, fenced in, we're fired up, missiles all cooled down, ready to go here, and we're going to go and play.
His military background helps him assess the Pentagon's performance.
How many hours these airplanes have on them, basically?
Yeah, most of ours have about 750 to 850.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years old now.
Yeah. On trips like this, he uses his skill as a former bomber pilot to separate fact from fiction. Today's flight gives him a pilot's point of view on how the F-16 handles.
So you're an old pro at this?
I don't know about that. I've done a lot of it, but it's been a long time, you know.
While often critical of the military establishment, he supports the administration's military buildup. The American Conservative Union gave him a 100% rating in his first 2 years in Congress.
Newsweek said I was a cheap hawk, but I'm a hawk.
Hawk?
A cheap hawk.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely a hawk. I believe that we need to have a strong America. Whatever makes a stronger America, I think that's important.
Smith came to Washington hoping to get onto the House Armed Services Committee, the powerful body that last year authorized $300 billion for defense. But despite his combat experience and conservative credentials, he was not picked for the administration's team, in part because he came from Oregon, which ranks 49th out of 50 states in military spending.
You're chosen to go on the Armed Services Committee based on whether you have a base in your district or whether you have a large defense industry.
Why is that?
Well, you normally have to have some kind of a conflict of interest, I guess, is the way you put it.
Blocked from a spot on the team, Smith found his own way to keep tabs on the Pentagon and become a power player. He allied himself with like-minded members of Congress in the Military Reform Caucus. And as a Vietnam vet with many old friends in the military, Denny Smith had a ready-made channel to another leg of the dissident triangle. Pentagon officers and civilians outraged by what they saw as the waste, rigidity, and cover-ups of the Pentagon brass.
I had some friends in the Pentagon and some retired people who came to me and said, say, we've got some real difficulties. Why don't you look into some of these things? So we asked some questions about it. And the more questions we asked, the less answers we got out of the Pentagon. There is a lack of need to cooperate because I'm not in the Iron Triangle. I'm outside that. So we've had to improvise, and it's amazing how many people have called, come over on their days off, out of uniform, to just give us some specific.
What you're saying is in order to find out the real story, you got to have moles inside the Pentagon.
We've got to have moles inside the Pentagon, inside the contractors, inside where they know what's going on.
The anonymity Denny Smith provides his moles is essential. Few people dare risk going public as a whistleblower. Look at what happened to James Burton, the Air Force colonel in charge of testing the Army's Great Hope, the Bradley fighting vehicle, a 20-ton troop carrier. Burton was a career man. He insisted on realistic tests which showed the dangers from enemy hits to American GIs riding in the vehicle. Burton broke the rules of the Pentagon's game when he testified to Congress that the Army brass was playing down the dangers.
We disagree on the consequences. All the evidence shows that the troops will be driven out of the vehicle by the contaminated atmosphere inside. This has serious consequences in terms of possibly more casualties or whether or not the vehicle can continue to fight if the troops have evacuated. From this, I conclude that we must arrange things so the troops do not get driven out. I went through a period where the first time I really raised the issue, my job was eliminated. And then promises were made that I would continue with the tests until the tests were over. And then just 6 months after that, there was an attempt to send me to Alaska. I took it upon myself to be the bearer of the bad news, simply because so many other people were bringing nothing but good news. And it did put me on opposite sides of the table with my service, with the people that I usually dealt with.
Colonel Burton was a casualty of the Iron Triangle game. The Army offered him dead-end jobs till he quit. Because of such reprisals, most critics inside the Pentagon go underground, leaking their information privately to members of Congress or to the press, hoping that exposés will fix weapons or halt the price scandals. Ironically, for years, the Pentagon's own news digest picked up the bad news from the dissidents and fed it to the Pentagon hierarchy every morning for breakfast. Official Washington is still asleep right now, but folks here in the heart of the Pentagon have been at work for 5 hours putting together the hottest official newspaper in the American government. It's called the Early Bird. This is a hot newspaper you can see. This is not your daily racing form. It's not stock tables. It's a tip sheet for the players in the Pentagon power game. It's a digest, 18 pages, of the most important news affecting the Pentagon and foreign policy, produced by a couple of hundred American newspapers all across the country.
Does anybody have that submarine story?
Chris Shaw runs the graveyard ship. She decides which good news and bad news will get reprinted in the Early Bird. That helps set the daily agenda for the Pentagon. It's put together for the top brass so they can read it early in the morning. But what's fascinating about this is it's also the vehicle of the dissident triangle, because it contains the stories that have broken in the press about major weapon systems, scandals, overpricing, tests that go wrong. No one was a more avid reader than former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. His driver, Matthew Turner, used to come at dawn and pick up the first copy.
Every morning.
Every morning?
Every morning.
Where do you go from here?
I'm headed to the boss' house.
The boss's house, Caspar Weinberger. What do you got here for him?
Oh, I got newspapers for the day, the Early Bird and so forth.
And he reads them on the way
on
into
the way
town?
in, right.
The top people in the Pentagon better have read the Early Bird, because at the morning staff meeting, Cap was sure to ask them about the problems that popped up in the Early Bird.
Good news is not news as a rule. Bad news is interesting, so we do see a lot of bad news coming out in the Early Bird, and it's a useful thing, and certainly bad information seems to flow quicker through the press than it does through official channels, so it's very useful to get that bad information and begin to work on it right away.
In fact, several defense secretaries have capitalized on bad news leaks to the press to help keep track of problems in the Pentagon. According to one insider, the Early Bird under Weinberger was more than useful, it was essential.
I think the difference between CAP and the other secretaries is CAP, it's almost as an exclusive management tool, whereas other secretaries have used it as an adjunct to other things. But CAP, for example, never would have you in for a review of your objectives or go over particular programs. He was busy doing lots of things outside the Pentagon, and so that became his only way, really, of communicating with his deputies.
Frank Carlucci, Reagan's second defense secretary, wanted the Early Bird under tighter control and turned it over to his assistant secretary for public affairs. The Early Bird's founder, Harry Zubkov, squawked that the paper would no longer highlight problems with weapon systems as it did in the case of the Ticonderoga. The Navy claimed that this lead ship of its new $36 billion class of Aegis cruisers demonstrated superb warfighting characteristics during a major test in April 1983. But a Wall Street Journal reporter brought some discrepancies to light, and Denny Smith's moles confirmed there was trouble.
We went to the Navy and asked them for some information about the Ticonderoga. They didn't give us anything for about 6 months. I finally went to Trent Lott, who is the whip on the Republican side, and asked him if he would help. He called John Lehman and said, why don't you give this guy what he wants on the Ticonderoga? I mean, it's all he's asked for is the test results. So we got the Navy finally, after about 6 months, to bring over the test report. And we had an admiral and a couple of commanders in here, and they brought this report. And I'd been told by some of the people in our kitchen cabinet group which page to look for. It was A29. It was in the appendix. So I thumbed through it. There was no A29.
No page A29?
No page A29. So I said, well, there doesn't seem to be a page A29. And they said, oh, well, it must have been the Xerox. I said, the Xerox? And the admiral said, oh, well, here's one. You can have this report. So he gave us another report. It did have A29 in there, which was a synopsis page in the appendix telling about all the shots.
So the A29 was the key page?
That was the key page.
It was the report card, is that it?
It was the report card. That's a good way to put it.
When you looked at A29, could you tell whether or not the system had passed or failed?
Well, they'd advertised the fact this was the most tested boat that they'd ever put in the water, and that page absolutely refuted it. They didn't want us to have those answers because they knew doggone well they didn't have their skirts clean. And so when we got the results, then we started pushing them to test the thing more.
Stacking weapons tests and tinkering with test results are important tactics in the iron triangle game, where rational players often make irrational decisions. What is it that causes people to brush aside problems that not only represent money but lives?
Well, first off, you know, you got the congressman whose district they're going to produce the thing in. And then you've got the receiving service. And you've got a project officer assigned to that, maybe for up to 5 to 10 years. And that's his career. If that thing doesn't make it to the water or into the air or onto the tracks, he's not going to get promoted. So it is in his best interest to keep this thing moving.
He's usually a colonel rank, has a large staff. His job and his career and his future depends quite heavily upon how well he can usher the system through the process, from concept through development, into procurement, and into the inventory. He's a very powerful man, and over a period of time, he becomes the chief advocate for the system.
What you're saying here is that the things that are moving people are keeping the money flow going.
Yes.
Advancing careers.
Yes.
And keeping weapons systems kind of alive and going.
Yes, sir. That's kind of sounds a little shocking, but I believe that a strong case can be made for that. Yes, sir.
Once a new weapons system gets the power of the money flow behind it, it moves like a gravy train down a greased track. Once it has left the station and reached the development phase, it is almost impossible to stop, even when tests show that the weapon does not work the way it was supposed to. One of the most notorious examples, the Sergeant York, or DIVAD anti-aircraft gun. The DIVAD was conceived in the mid-70s to provide anti-aircraft defenses for the Army's tank divisions against Soviet fighters and helicopters. Even though its tests in 1981 and 1982 showed big problems, the Army decided to rush it into production. But by mid-1984, DIVAD was in deep trouble, plagued by repeated technical snafus, politically wounded by news leaks of embarrassing test failures. But despite its problems, it had staying power, protected not only by the Pentagon brass and its contractors, but by members of Congress whose home districts got pork barrel jobs from the project. Charts like this one, spread around Congress by Westinghouse, a major contractor, underscored that saying no to DIVAD and saying no to jobs for constituents. In Congress, its chief critic was Denny Smith, who said DIVAD would not protect U.S. tanks. In the Pentagon, DIVAD's chief critic was a young Marine colonel, Tom Carter. Carter was the military analyst for test and evaluation of the DIVAD. He had flown 400 missions in Vietnam.
As a pilot, I perhaps had a different viewpoint about an anti-aircraft gun than the Army air defenders did. I knew what would scare me stiff if I were in a cockpit, and I knew the DIVAD wouldn't. it had never been challenged by a really difficult target using evasive tactics and aggressive pilot tactics. It simply didn't look like that big a threat.
So Carter started requesting the raw test data to perform his own analysis.
And I would ask a hard question about what went on in this test or that test. Then they'd try one of two tactics very typically. They'd either flood me with data and give me, stacks of computer printouts, reams of data in such a raw form that it was virtually unusable and couldn't be interpreted, or else they'd starve me out. They'd give me a data synopsis. They'd give me a summary of test results, one that had already been processed by their analysts. And as a result, I couldn't put any faith in it. I couldn't tell whether it was the truth or whether it was an invention. Or it's called smoothing the data. It's called manipulating the data.
Carter convinced himself that the system needed more rigorous testing, but convincing the Army was quite another thing. Colonel Burton was Carter's boss at the time. He remembers one particular clash.
There must have been 6 Army generals in the meeting. They'd come from far and wide around the country to meet with him and get him to back off and not keep pushing for an operational test. And they had beaten him down to where he was about ready to give in. And he looked up at the clock and he said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, my carpool leaves in 2 minutes. I have to leave."
I didn't do it out of any sense of disrespect for them. It was more frustration on my own part that I didn't think I was going to ever change their mind.
On the other hand, they didn't change your mind.
No, I felt I was looking at facts, and they were dealing more in sort of emotions and wishes.
And he got up and left, and they sat there. They didn't know what to think. They looked at each other, and one started swearing at another. Says, "Christ, you had me come all the way in from El Paso for this. Now what are we going to do?"
In late 1984, a group of Capitol Hill dissidents, the Military Reform Caucus, got Congress to bar further purchases until DIVAD clearly passed tough field tests. So 6 weeks of tests were run, and the Army emerged jubilant, pronouncing DIVAD a success. But Denny Smith got a tip from a mole that the tests were too easy, and that in many of the cases the Army prematurely destroyed the target by remote control, making it impossible to tell whether DIVAD had scored a kill or not. Denny Smith got hold of a videotape that seemed to confirm the report.
3 rounds detonating near the lead aircraft resulted in loss of control of the drone, a scored kill. It was destroyed by range control to prevent its crashing outside safety limits.
It's very impressive film. It looks like they're all shot down. See, that's 1.8 miles range, and they were supposed to be trying to...
There's another one that looks like it's shot down.
It looked like it shot
How
down.
do you know for sure that it wasn't?
We'd have never known unless the individual who was there at the test said that they had ground destructed them.
Carter saw some of the tests and all of the data.
Well, it was my worst fears or my worst suspicions that were confirmed, really. And that was that the DIVAD gun couldn't detect and track and engage and shoot down enemy aircraft unless the enemy aircraft were using unrealistic tactics, like flying up high where no pilot in his right mind, Russian or American, will fly, using some sort of augmentation, or using just plain dumb tactics.
News tonight with
As so often happens, the game became a battle. The dissident triangle trying to kill the DIVAD program versus the Iron Triangle trying to save it.
We, as an institution, tried our absolute best to make these tests absolutely objective, impartial, fair, open, and the very best that we could produce. And it makes me so mad to see something like this come out in the press. It just infuriates me.
While the Army pushed Weinberger to keep sinking billions into DIVAD, Colonel Carter drafted a scathing report for the Secretary of Defense, spelling out the weapons' flaws. The top brass tried to suppress Carter's report, but it leaked, and it gave congressional critics hot new ammunition.
Now, I understand at least one of those copies, and maybe more, got up to Capitol Hill. One of them got to Congressman Denny Smith of Oregon. How did it get there?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Congressman Smith had been very interested in the DIVAD story all along. He'd made life miserable for some of the generals and some of the leadership in asking very informed questions. And how he got that copy of the report, I truly don't know.
But you didn't get it to him?
I didn't give it to him.
I didn't give it to him, if that's what you're after. I didn't give it to him, that's for sure. The building is full of Xerox machines. And there's one thing you have to understand in that building. If you write something or sign your name to something or prepare a document, You have to think in the back of your mind that sooner or later this is going to wind up in the hands of my worst enemies or on the front page of the Post.
Denny Smith phoned Caspar Weinberger to say he had the report. The implied threat was that he'd make it public and get Congress to act unless Weinberger himself killed Divad.
What'd he say?
Oh, yes, I'm more than aware of it, and we'll be looking that over and making our decision tomorrow. And I said, well, I thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just appreciate the call.
And when you have to conclude on the basis of the production models that it's not going to work as well as is needed, then you have to decide whether you can try to fix it up or whether you cancel it. And in this case, it seemed to me there were enough things wrong and enough uncertainty, so we canceled it. Yes, the total amount that's been invested is $1.8 billion.
He ought to do that every year. He ought to just pick one and do that every year. Boy, would that shake up the business. It
What would
really
be the positive result?
Oh, you would start getting more realism, more objectivity, less advocacy, and less of the games played with advocacy in mind.
Tom Carter did a service for the country, but he did not play by the rules of the game. Instead of getting a medal, he was handed a distant foreign assignment without his family. He chose retirement.
This one young man basically took on the whole system by himself. The test would never have occurred. The results would never have been examined like they were, and the decision Mr. Weinberger made in the end would never have happened if it had not been for him. And everybody in the building knew it, and when he retired, he tried to get a job inside the building as a civilian and couldn't.
What happens to a test officer, an evaluator, who's not as forthright, who's not as aggressive as you, and who goes along with the system a bit more?
Oh, I suppose he could look forward to being the first DIVAD brigade commander. And I think it would serve him right.
Far more powerful than the dissident triangle is the iron triangle, the symbiotic relationship of military services, defense contractors, and congressional committees on armed services and defense appropriations, both stacked with members mainly from districts where military spending is heavy and visible. And the key to the iron triangle game is the money flow. The smart player keeps the money flowing widely.
What's your call sign? 4 Big League 01, sir.
There is no better way to understand the iron triangle game than to take lessons from John Lehman, who served 6 years as Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy. Lehman personifies the Pentagon power game. No one in recent years has played it more successfully. Lehman is a slick, cocky, rough-and-tumble operator. No one has ever accused him of indecision.
We did come in with a very clear idea of what we wanted to do. The Navy had suffered terribly in the 70s through 3 administrations. It was in really bad shape. We had less than a week's ammunition. We had no spare parts. Nobody thought we could do the job.
Lehman arrived in Washington in 1981 with a leg up on rivals, for he had already learned to work Congress as Henry Kissinger's political liaison. And he had a blueprint for forward naval strategy developed while working on Kissinger's national security staff.
That was the top priority, to restore the morale and self-confidence of the Navy. And to do that, you had to give the Navy back a clear mission and the tools and resources to carry it out. And that was the 600-ship Navy.
The problem that we are going to have is to sustain that Navy in terms of the number of ships that was originally planned because of the high operations cost, the personnel costs, and so forth. But that was not John Lehman's problem.
Before the other secretaries even knew their way to the restrooms, Lehman won the president's endorsement of his plans.
We're committed to a 600-ship Navy, a Navy that is big enough to deter aggression wherever it might occur.
He sold the president, and then he sold the public, who was savvy with the press. One example of Lehman's finesse, a real showbiz production. He flew in 46 members of the press, covering virtually all of California's major news outlets, 100 miles offshore to witness live fire on a battleship.
Tell the truth now. How many of you flinched?
Mr. Secretary, today we saw a rather impressive display of firepower for us, but you know, a lot of people, military analysts, are saying that Navy firepower is really obsolete, and we're wasting a lot of taxpayers' money putting all this millions of dollars into battleships like this.
Well, of course, first of all, the millions of dollars cost less for this ship than it did for one new frigate, one of these Fig 7s that you see out here. It's got more firepower. It can deliver 800 tons of accurate firepower, such as you just saw, in 30 minutes at a range of 24 miles.
As shrewd as he was with the press, Lehman was even shrewder on the Hill. He understood their lifeblood, jobs for their constituents.
I think that John Lehman deserves the championship belt for understanding how to lobby Congress, spread contracts around, and make them politically hard to say no.
What did 2 carriers cost?
2 carriers cost $7 billion.
Okay. And what does that mean in jobs? What does that mean to the country economically?
It means about 40,000 jobs for a year-long job, 40,000 per $1 billion. It's a tremendous multiplier effect in the economy because what we're buying is steel, smokestack industry kinds of things. Big generators and huge valves and, you know, thousands of toilets and sinks and stoves and kettles, and I mean, it's a huge city you're buying.
By the time you put the aircraft on, don't you figure you got all 50 states covered?
Oh, at least. Sure, all 50 are covered.
Does the Navy deliberately spread the subcontracts so that it gets a very good political spread all over?
Oh, I don't think there's any question, looking at major weapons systems, that the contractors will try to make sure that at least if they will spread them as much as they can, but given a choice between putting a contract in, assuming apples for apples, and all other things being relatively equal, in the home state of the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, or in the home state of a freshman senator from state X, there's no question in my mind where that contract goes. I've seen too much of it.
So is there an iron triangle at work here pushing weapons procurement? You've got the Navy, you've got the Navy contractors, and you've got the Navy senators and congressmen, all of them working together to try to get something for their service or their district or their company?
Well, sure. I mean, of course, that's it's called the Constitution. You know, that's what Article 2 is all about. It's an invitation for the executive branch and the legislative branch to struggle over the control of defense policy. And so, obviously, private enterprise and industry plays an intermediary role.
But sometimes the Iron Triangle trips itself up with its intimate relationships and revolving doors. After Lehman left office in 1986, Navy and FBI investigators pounced on middlemen, the consultants who work both for industry and the Pentagon. Lehman's head of weapons procurement, former Assistant Secretary Melvin Paisley, was listed in documents seized from one contractor.
In Congress, the bastions of Iron Triangle power are the Armed Services Committees and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittees. They authorize the weapons, they fund the programs, and they protect the Pentagon. For these committees are stacked with members whose home ground houses military bases and big defense contractors. Look, for example, at the main congressional defenders of DIVAD. Robert Badham from the California district where DIVAD was assembled. Marjorie Holt, Armed Services Committee, from the Maryland district where DIVAD's radar was built. Bill Nichols from Anniston, Alabama, where DIVAD's chassis was made. And Ron Coleman from the Texas district containing the Army base where DIVAD was conceived, fostered, and initially tested. Even critics of the Pentagon, like Senator David Pryor of Arkansas, cannot resist the money game.
We have a lot of congressmen and senators who lobby the Pentagon for particular missions in their own state. And listen, I do it also. I'm one of those who wants to improve the capability and improve the mission of our 2 bases right there in the state of Arkansas and at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and wherever. If those dollars are going out there, I say that our people are more than qualified to perform those functions. And I guess you would say that I've fallen into the trap, if you want to say that.
Pryor believes a strong defense begins at home with the Guard.
Call it a trap, but it came in handy in his re-election campaign.
But I think we cannot sacrifice this major part of our whole military preparedness right here.
David Pryor, Arkansas comes first.
But the game works both ways. It's not just what the military can do for you, it's what you can do for the military.
2 to 3 years ago, a general in the Air Force, Rick, was sitting right where you were sitting in that chair, and we were talking about the new C-17 transport plane. I said, if the C-17 does come online, what are the possibilities of stationing the C-17 program or mission in the state of Arkansas? Well, the general hum-hawed around a little bit, and he says, well, I don't know. He says, you know, you don't have a real good reputation for supporting the military. I said, wait a minute, I want to know a little more about that. What do you mean, reputation? Well, he turned to this colonel who was sitting right here. He says, Colonel, do you have Senator Pryor's sheet?
His sheet?
And the colonel cringed and almost coughed, I guess, and says, yes, I do. And he reached in his pocket and gave it to the general. I said, I'd like to see this. And sure enough, I had a little report card. There's my report card. That is from the Air Force. I demanded that I keep this. For example, they had here critical of President ignoring the war powers resolution, authored audit for warhead production, authored bill to abolish the Defense Contract Audit Agency.
Do you want to tell me who that general was?
No, I don't care to do that. I think he realized that he made a severe and, as they say, strategic error.
Well, are you reluctant to mention this general's name because of the fact that he's in a position that could affect money that comes into Arkansas, defense money?
But he would have some control, yes, over dollars that go into the state of Arkansas.
Even the most arch conservatives have gotten fed up with the military game playing. Arizona's longtime Senator Barry Goldwater, known as a staunch supporter of a strong defense, became outraged. In the mid-1980s, he pushed for reform and opened fire on the most ingenious plan of them all, home porting. It was John Lehman's brainchild, breaking up the concentration of ships at Norfolk and San Diego and dispersing them to 7 new Navy ports on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. Critics dubbed his scheme home porking because it so blatantly sought political support by passing out Pentagon money.
Now that was political hogwash, because we've got plenty of water to put those big ships in. The Congress passed it. So what does it mean? 7 cities, the congressmen and the senators are now beholden to anything the Navy wants to come down with. Or the Navy will say, well, we won't have to build that port. I called it that. I called it a blatant example of politics. Lost a lot of good friends and got the secretary mad at me.
Well, the basic idea behind home porting is self-evident. If you go take a helo over San Diego or Norfolk, you've got 128 ships in Norfolk, 122 in San Diego, crammed together, rafted together. It just makes no sense from any point of view. It is overcrowded. From a military point of view, it's an inescapable target. I mean, for cruise missile, conventional cruise missiles, mining, and we just can't stuff any more in there. We've got to disperse.
It makes no sense strategically. It makes a lot of sense politically. I mean, the Soviets have 10,000 warheads, so there's no way that putting a few ships in New York and a few in San Francisco and a few up in Everett, Washington, outside Seattle is going to make a great deal of difference.
The only place he didn't put a battleship was Omaha.
What's that all about?
Well, you know, John was just politically very apt. Now, nothing's wrong with putting ships and dispersing ships. That's good strategy. But I wonder which came first, the strategy of dispersal or the strategy of how many votes can you get in the Senate?
This is as much a problem with American defense as anything we've ever had in the Pentagon.
Are we just talking about money?
Money.
Is this just wasting money?
Wasting money. I'll give you, go ahead.
Millions? Are we talking about billions? Are we talking
billions?
Tens of billions?
Billions. Probably tens.
So
what do you say to Barry Goldwater when he says this is pure unadulterated politics? It's not home porting, but home porking, I think is the phrase he used.
I say, well, Senator, if you vote for us, maybe we can get a battleship into Arizona.
That'd be quite a trick.
We have focused so far on the clash between the Iron Triangle and the Dissident Triangle. But even more fateful power games are played by the military services. Even more is at stake in the turf cartel game played inside the Pentagon.
Here we are at the heart of the Navy's turf in the Pentagon, just outside the office of the Secretary of the Navy. This hallway is steeped in Navy tradition.
Right here is Teddy Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Franklin Roosevelt, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
The hall is also lined with battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, Trident submarines, the symbols of the Navy's current power. And across the way, symbols of the Navy's past victories. All along this hallway, inside the offices, you have the sense of the Navy's presence. Brass door knockers, oak doors, inside the Navy Secretary's room. The clocks don't tick away the hours, they chime the bells as if they were on shipboard. So these are the symbols of the Navy's turf. And if you move to other sections of the Pentagon, the Army sections or the Air Force sections, you'd find similar symbols. What you get out of this, these various different sections of the Pentagon, is a sense and the symbols of the rivalry between the services, each fighting for its share of the budget, each fighting for its weapons, each trying to push its case and its mission. It's part of the power game of Washington.
And the game of service rivalries worries major players like House Armed Services Committee Chairman Les Aspin.
And if you turn around and ask the Army in a budget hearing, because we have to cut the Army budget, we say, all right, what would you cut? Inevitably, the thing they come back and cut is the Army's support for the airfields. If you ask the Air Force, what do they cut? The first thing on their list to cut is the ground support planes for the Army. The first thing their service wants to cut is the stuff that they've got in their budget in support of another service. Each of the services really has certain missions that are their traditional missions. And these things are where the service lives and dies. I mean, that's the heart and soul of the mission of that service. And those get funded no matter what, because that's what the service really wants to do. And in the case of the Navy, we're thinking primarily of aircraft carriers. The surface air Navy is a big constituency in the Navy. And it'll make sure that we fund aircraft carriers.
Air Force?
Air Force, same thing. You've got a bomber Air Force, you've got a fighter Air Force, and you got the Military Airlift Command, the guys who run the transport. They're kind of a stepsister of the operation. The main thing is the bomber pilots and the fighter pilots. The core of the Army, of course, is the combat arms, which is the infantry, essentially the infantry and the armor.
Okay, so you're talking about in each service there are these big packages of turf.
Right.
Then each service is itself a big package of turf.
Correct.
So,
and then there's lots of turf that doesn't fall into anybody's package, and unless the Secretary of Defense takes that as his turf, it doesn't get funded. And come a war, we're going to find ourselves woefully short in some areas which are just vital.
General Edward C. Meyer, Army Chief of Staff in the Carter and Reagan administrations, spells out the consequences of service turf games for the Army.
The biggest challenges that troubled me as Chief of Staff of the Army was that we had an Army which was getting better as far as its own capabilities were concerned, that we were getting better people, getting better equipment, we were improving the training, but the Army still couldn't go to war because the sinews of war, the ability to be able to get off to war and sustain you when you got there, weren't in place. The airlift and sea lift to take you to war, the supplies that are necessary to sustain you when you got there weren't in place.
In Vietnam, American combat effectiveness was hurt because every branch of the service demanded a piece of the action. The U.S. had not one Air Force, but 5 Air Forces fighting separate wars. 1 for the Army, Navy, Marines, and 2 for the Air Force. Other military operations have suffered from service parochialism. Grenada, for example.
Well, we didn't even have an overall commander on the ground. We had 2 commanders that had equal authority, and the commander was offshore. And that was partly reflected because we had a Marine contingent and an Army contingent. And I don't know what the internal quarrels were, but you could I suppose, speculate that they didn't want one, either Marine or Army person to be over the other ground forces, so it had to be someone offshore. That was a very dangerous situation.
A regiment of Marines, specially trained just for that type of action, could have accomplished the whole thing in one day. But what did we have? We had the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines without any ability to communicate with each other, without any ability to communicate with the headquarters in the United States, and they finally had to use a credit card of one of the personnel to call his wife in order to get in touch with the headquarters to know what the hell was going on.
Sure, given a little more time, we could have easily transferred the radios and the frequencies to do it. But it's crazy to suppose that every part of every service should be able to operate instantaneously, interoperate with every other part.
Before they got through with this thing, everybody got in the act. Well, they ordered, as I remember correctly, over 7,000 medals to be awarded for an action that probably would have required 1,200, 1,500 people.
In all, according to the Pentagon, 28,675 medals were awarded.
Now, you mentioned overwhelming force, and that's exactly right. That's the one thing that I insisted on, was that whatever was recommended to me as the required force, I doubled, because I didn't want to have anything like the Iranian hostage rescue failed attempt or anything of that kind. We wanted to have sufficient forces there to do the job. And we did it. We did it on time, and we did it, I think, extraordinarily well. And you're going to tell me that one or two of the radios didn't work, and I'm going to agree with you. But the test is, did we get the 1,000 Americans out, and did we pacify the island? Did we turn it over quickly to a democratic regime? And the answer to all of those is yes, we did.
But to other defense experts, the real lesson of Grenada is not whether we won or lost. After all, how could we have lost? The lasting lesson is the dangers of parochialism. General David Jones, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Generally, since World War II, rather than that synergism of the total being more than the sum of the individual parts, we've had the opposite of synergism. The Soviets, fortunately, had the same thing. There were a lot of problems in Grenada working together have been revealed. There are other, incidents where we've had difficulty, and some operations have gone quite well, like in the bombing of Libya over well, where you do something and get it over in a matter of minutes. We generally do better than something that's very complicated that requires considerable time, and longer, such as Vietnam, the worse our problems.
Taking the present situation, are you concerned that troops couldn't fight well together because of the kinds of problems? You would be concerned?
Yes. And I have been concerned. I've expressed my concern over time, and I'm still concerned.
And it would cost what? Casualties, money?
It would, the biggest challenge would be, the biggest danger would be that you, as a result of our current capability, you would have to use nuclear weapons far more rapidly than you might otherwise have to do. And it may even mean that you had to use nuclear weapons where if you had a better capability, you wouldn't have to use nuclear weapons.
That's pretty serious.
That is serious.
Despite their celebrated rivalries, the military services actually engage in collusion to protect their interests. After World War II, the service chiefs parceled out the military missions in a formal agreement, and they try to avoid painful fights that would upset that arrangement. No service seriously challenges what the others want to do. The Navy does not test its ships against Air Force planes, and the Army does not tell the Navy it needs minesweepers for the Persian Gulf. They operate like a cartel, foiling efforts by civilian bosses to divide and rule them. They reach agreements among themselves, each with a veto power.
So everybody had to agree. And when everybody has to agree, what has kind of an operation developed was that if you were the Air Force chief, you never messed in the Navy business in exchange for the Navy admiral, who was the CNO, never getting involved in your business. In other words, a modus operandi developed where everybody stayed out of everybody else's turf.
You will not get an Air Force officer who is an expert in rocket procurement to tell the Army in 1981 that its Viper program ought to be scrapped. That's where that should have happened. Should have happened there. It says a volume about what's wrong with procurement and what's wrong with the system when we on the Hill have to finally prove the point at a cost of much money.
The name of the game is money. Each service wants to protect its share, and collusion helps.
When it all shakes out, it is remarkable how stable the funding is among the services in terms of the percentage of the pie that traditionally over the years each of the services gets.
In their frustration, congressional reformers made several moves to change the way the game is played and to control military parochialism. The main move was to change the power structure inside the Pentagon. Despite Weinberger's resistance, Congress passed reforms in 1986 aimed at imposing unity and more centralized control. It set up a new procurement czar and gave more power to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to ride herd on the military turf cartel.
We now have a man created by this legislation who's already at work in the Pentagon to make basic decisions like, do we need 2 tactical aircraft for this particular purpose? If we don't, then let's do away with 1 or do away with 2. Is our tank a proper weapon to fight in the sands and loose dirt of the Middle East? Or is it only equipped to fight on the grassy plains of Europe? Those are decisions that the military commanders really never got around to making.
Another move was to set up an independent testing office to correct the bias in testing done by the military services. But the Iron Triangle is expert at derailing reforms. It fought the testing idea, then dragged its feet for a year before appointing an office director, and then it picked an Iron Triangle player, Jack Krings, for 25 years a test pilot for a defense contractor. The backers of the testing office were furious.
Where was Jack Krings from? Well, he was from the military-industrial complex. He had been a pilot for so many years with McDonnell Douglas. He came from their own kinship, their own brethren. And I opposed his nomination on the floor. I opposed him. And I told him I was going to oppose him because I thought we needed someone independent and more independent. Otherwise, we're going to continue building weapons that don't work, that waste money, and endanger the lives of our own fighting sons.
While I may have been in that industry, the unique position that I held, as many other people, certainly not the only one, we were the bad news guys in any company, and we're often looked at as kind of like the consumer advocate or the conscience of the company or something. We're the ones that tell the engineer that doesn't work or tell the program manager that he's got a lousy airplane, you know.
But the Congressional Watchdog Agency, the General Accounting Office, sees things differently. In 1987 and 1988, the GAO issued stinging report cards on Krings' testing office. The way the Pentagon has undermined the new testing office has convinced many defense experts that the larger structural reforms at the top of the Pentagon are being sabotaged by the Iron Triangle.
It is like moving one giant boulder. You kind of move it inch by inch. You don't move it yards at a time.
Are you satisfied that there is that kind of commitment?
I'm not satisfied yet, no.
You're not satisfied?
No, I am not.
Why not?
I'm not satisfied because there was a reluctance to accept the changes. I haven't seen an enthusiastic acceptance of the changes.
So we could have the reforms enacted, but not applied or watered down.
It's absolutely essential that that between the administration and Congress, there is a better agreement on what we're doing with our defense dollars and a better agreement on the prioritization. If that doesn't take place, then our country's really in trouble.
This is not to say the nation faces nuclear calamity. The combined nuclear strength of our military services is awesome. But in conventional warfare, there is real cause for concern. DIVAD's problems may be more extreme than those of other weapons, but all weapons have problems, even the vaunted MX missile. And the answer is not to sweep them under the rug, but to give them tough, realistic, independent testing. Service rivalry hurts combat effectiveness, and it costs lives. It increases the danger of escalation to nuclear war. Tonight, we have focused on case studies that highlight problems, because in the Pentagon, even modest problems have severe consequences for the nation, consequences that trouble the experts. And second, these problems are not spurious or random. They are systemic. They are part of the fabric of our system. Everybody is playing the game. Congress, the contractors, the military, and the voters. In short, the Pentagon power game goes on, and it will confront and confound our next president and the next one until the voters declare they have had enough. I'm Hedrick Smith. Good night.
On our next program, The Unelected, we'll see how great chunks of power have passed from our elected officials to people for whom you never voted.